The envelope from Idaho First Bank felt heavier than it should have as I carried it from my mailbox to the kitchen table of my modest duplex on Fairview Avenue. At 72, I'd learned to dread unexpected mail from financial institutions, but this one carried particular weight because I'd been waiting for it. 6 months ago, my son David had promised me something that seemed too good to be true. Now, staring at the bank statement that would either validate my faith in him or confirm my deepest fears, I realized I was about to discover which it was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light streaming through my small kitchen window illuminated numbers that made no sense. Where I expected to see evidence of the promised $200,000, I found instead a pattern of transactions that turned my blood cold. My reading glasses slipped down my nose as I squinted at entry after entry, each one representing money flowing in the wrong direction entirely. This wasn't the investment success David had described with such confidence. This was something else entirely. Something that made 35 years of experience as a certified public accountant scream warnings in my head. David had called me 6 months earlier with excitement I hadn't heard in his voice since he was a teenager. "Dad, I've finally done it," he'd said, his words tumbling over each other in enthusiasm. "I've secured a major investment opportunity, something that's going to change everything for our family." He'd explained that he needed to temporarily access my retirement savings account, the one I'd built carefully over decades of modest living and careful planning. The deal required immediate capital, he said, but the returns would be extraordinary. $200,000 profit, guaranteed within 6 months, enough to secure both our financial futures. I should have been suspicious. Harold Mitchell, CPA for 35 years, specialist in small business auditing, detector of financial irregularities and accounting fraud, should have recognized the warning signs immediately. But when your son calls with genuine excitement about finally achieving the success he'd always promised, when he uses terms like exclusive opportunity and guaranteed returns, when he sounds more confident than you've heard him in years, you want to believe. You want to think that maybe, just maybe, this time will be different. The process had seemed legitimate enough. David arrived at my house with official-looking documents, investment prospectuses that appeared professionally prepared, contracts with letterheads from firms I didn't recognize but that sounded impressively corporate. He'd explained the complexities with the fluency of someone who genuinely understood the financial mechanisms involved. His wife Jessica had accompanied him, nodding appropriately and adding supportive comments about how this opportunity would finally allow David to prove himself as the successful businessman she'd always known he could be. Looking back now, with the benefit of the devastating clarity that comes from seeing the truth, I could identify every red flag I'd missed. The investment firm's address that led to a mail forwarding service, the references to exclusive opportunities available only to family members of existing clients, the urgency that required immediate action without time for independent verification. Most damning of all, the way David's explanations became vague and circular when I asked specific questions about risk assessment or regulatory oversight. But at the time, I'd seen only my son's enthusiasm and what appeared to be his first real chance at the kind of success he'd always been chasing for years. David had struggled professionally since college, jumping from one opportunity to another without ever quite achieving the stability that would allow him to support Jessica in the manner she clearly expected. She'd grown up in a wealthy family, attended private schools, vacationed in places I could never afford to visit. Her expectations weren't unreasonable for someone of her background, but they were impossible for someone married to my son without a reliable income source. The loan I'd made to David had represented nearly everything I'd saved for my retirement. $68,000 accumulated through decades of careful budgeting, choosing generic groceries over name brands, driving my Honda Civic until the repair costs exceeded its value, taking vacations at state parks instead of resorts. It wasn't a fortune by most standards, but it represented security for my remaining years, the difference between comfortable aging and genuine hardship. David had insisted on formal documentation, which I'd appreciated as a sign of his newfound business sophistication. We'd signed promissory notes, established payment schedules, even discussed interest rates that seemed fair to both parties. He'd promised that within 6 months he'd return my initial investment plus $200,000 in profit. The math seemed impossible, but David had explained it in terms of leverage and market opportunities that sounded plausible enough when delivered with his characteristic confidence. Now, staring at the bank records spread across my kitchen table, I could see exactly where my money had gone. Not into any investment opportunity, not into any business venture that might generate returns, but into a lifestyle that had no connection to legitimate income. Car payments for a BMW I'd seen in David's driveway, credit card payments to high-end retailers, restaurants, luxury services, rent for an address in Eagle, one of Boise's most expensive suburbs, where David and Jessica had moved shortly after receiving my money. The most damaging revelation wasn't the misuse of my funds, though that was devastating enough. It was the systematic deception that had made the fraud possible. David hadn't simply borrowed money and spent it foolishly. He'd constructed an elaborate fiction, complete with fake documents, fictional investment opportunities, and carefully rehearsed explanations designed specifically to extract my life savings. The level of premeditation was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. My coffee grew cold as I traced the money trail through my son's account records. The $68,000 had lasted approximately 3 months, supporting a lifestyle that required $22,000 per month to maintain. Designer clothing purchases, expensive dinners, luxury hotel stays, recreational activities that cost more in a single weekend than I typically spent in a month. David and Jessica had transformed my modest retirement security into their personal entertainment fund. The secondary account records revealed an even more troubling pattern. David hadn't limited his deception to me. There were deposits from multiple sources, elderly names I recognized from our neighborhood and church community. Dorothy Chen, the widow next door who'd struggled with her husband's medical bills. Frank Williams, my former colleague from the accounting firm who'd trusted David because of our professional relationship. Maria Santos, whose late husband had served in Vietnam with my brother. Each deposit represented another victim, another trusting person whose faith David had exploited for his temporary financial convenience. What made the discovery even more painful was recognizing my own professional expertise reflected in the sophistication of David's fraud. He'd learned from watching me review financial documents over the years, understanding exactly what evidence would be convincing to someone with my background. The fake investment materials weren't amateur productions. They demonstrated knowledge of accounting principles, regulatory language, and financial terminology that could only have come from years of observing my work. My son had weaponized my own expertise against me.
The phone felt impossibly heavy as I dialed David's number, my hands trembling with a combination of rage and heartbreak that I hadn't experienced since my wife's death 15 years earlier. Each ring amplified the silence in my small duplex, where I'd lived simply and honestly, while my son constructed elaborate lies just 20 miles away in his luxury rental home. When the voicemail activated with David's confident voice promising to return calls promptly, I realized that even his communication had become part of the deception. I hung up without leaving a message, staring instead at the evidence scattered across my kitchen table. Bank statements that told a story of betrayal more complete than anything I'd encountered in decades of professional auditing. My son hadn't just stolen my money, he'd stolen my trust, my security, my faith in the family bonds I'd thought were unbreakable. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. David had promised $200,000 in profits, but had instead cost me everything I'd saved, along with my ability to believe that the son I'd raised possessed even basic integrity. The worst part wasn't the money, though losing my retirement savings at 72 was genuinely terrifying. The worst part was understanding that David had looked at his elderly father and seen nothing but an opportunity to exploit.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Every conversation about my financial concerns, every discussion about my modest lifestyle and careful budgeting had been research for him, information gathering that would make his eventual deception more effective. I'd been studied like a mark in a confidence game, evaluated for my vulnerabilities and targeted with precision that demonstrated not love, but calculated predation. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the financial documents that had shattered my remaining illusions about family loyalty, I began to understand that this wasn't just a story about money lost and promises broken. This was a story about the moment when a parent realizes that the child they've loved and supported has become someone capable of deliberate cruelty. The question wasn't whether I could recover my savings, though that mattered enormously. The question was whether I could find a way to respond that honored both my professional principles and my human need for justice. The 20-minute drive to Eagle felt like crossing into a different world entirely. My aging Honda struggled up the winding hills that led to David's neighborhood, past manicured golf courses and gated communities that represented the lifestyle my son had been pursuing with other people's money. The houses grew larger and more impressive as I navigated through streets lined with mature trees and professionally landscaped yards, each property representing more wealth than I'd accumulated in my entire working career. David's rental house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a sprawling, contemporary structure with floor-to-ceiling windows and an architectural style that screamed expensive taste. The circular driveway held two vehicles that together cost more than my annual Social Security income, Jessica's white BMW SUV and a silver Mercedes sedan I didn't recognize. The sight of them sparked a fresh wave of anger as I calculated the monthly payments my stolen retirement funds were likely covering. I parked on the street and walked up the stone pathway, clutching the bank documents in a manila folder that suddenly felt like evidence in a criminal case. The elaborate doorbell system chimed with musical notes that echoed through what sounded like a vast interior space. When David answered the door, his expression shifted immediately from casual confusion to something approaching panic. "Harold, what brings you out here? You should have called first." His voice carried a forced cheerfulness that barely concealed growing nervousness. The expensive polo shirt and designer jeans he wore represented more money than I typically spend on clothing in 6 months. "We need to discuss your investment opportunity."
I stepped past him into the foyer without waiting for an invitation, my accounting instincts automatically cataloging the expensive furnishings, original artwork, and marble flooring that surrounded me. This wasn't the home of someone building wealth through legitimate business ventures. This was the temporary luxury of someone spending other people's money at an unsustainable rate. David closed the door slowly, his casual demeanor already beginning to crack. "Is everything all right? You seem upset about something." The concern in his voice might have been convincing to someone who hadn't spent decades detecting financial irregularities and the lies that typically accompanied them. "I received my bank statements yesterday." I pulled out the folder and watched his face grow pale as he recognized the significance of what I carried. Care to explain how my retirement savings transformed into luxury car payments and country club memberships instead of investment profits? The living room David led me into looked like something from an interior design magazine. Leather furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries, an entertainment system that belonged in a theater, artwork that suggested someone with expensive tastes and unlimited resources. None of it belonged to a man whose last legitimate employment had ended over 2 years ago. "Dad, there must be some misunderstanding with the paperwork." David gestured toward one of the leather chairs, but I remained standing, keeping the physical advantage that height provided during confrontational conversations. Banks sometimes process transactions in ways that look confusing on statements. The transactions aren't confusing, David. They're quite clear. $68,000 moved from your investment account directly to luxury spending with no business purpose whatsoever. I opened the folder and began reading specific entries, watching his face grow progressively paler. BMW lease payment, $2,000 monthly. Nordstrom charges totaling $4,000. Chandler's Steakhouse, $800 for a single evening. Would you like me to continue? Jessica appeared at the top of the staircase like she was making a grand entrance, wearing workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her descent was calculated, designed to project confidence and control over a situation she clearly viewed as manageable. The diamond jewelry she wore caught the afternoon light streaming through those expensive windows, each piece representing money that should have been securing my retirement instead of decorating my son's wife. "Harold," she said with a tone someone might use to address a confused child, "you're getting yourself worked up over nothing. David's investment strategy is more complex than traditional approaches. Sometimes short-term expenses are necessary to position for larger returns." "Investment strategy?" I turned to face her directly, letting 35 years of professional skepticism show in my expression. "Jessica, David hasn't had legitimate employment in over 2 years. His investment expertise consists of spending other people's money on lifestyle expenses. What exactly qualified him to manage anyone's retirement funds?" Her composure wavered slightly, but she recovered with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to talking her way out of difficult situations. "Harold, you're getting yourself worked up over nothing. David's investment strategy is more complex than traditional approaches. Sometimes short-term expenses are necessary to position for larger returns." "Investment strategy?" I turned to face her directly, letting 35 years of professional skepticism show in my expression. "Jessica, David hasn't had legitimate employment in over 2 years. His investment expertise consists of spending other people's money on lifestyle expenses. What exactly qualified him to manage anyone's retirement funds?" "Harlot, you're being overly dramatic. David has been working on several business opportunities that require initial capital investment. The returns will justify the temporary expenses." "Temporary expenses?" I repeated the phrase with the contempt it deserved. $22,000 per month in lifestyle spending isn't temporary, Jessica. It's systematic fraud disguised as business strategy. And it's funded entirely by money stolen from elderly people who trusted your husband. David finally found his voice, but it came out strained and defensive. "Dad, you're making this sound much worse than it is. The business opportunities are legitimate. I just need more time to see the returns develop."
You've always told me that successful investing requires patience and faith in long-term strategies. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. David was using my own words about patience and long-term thinking to justify stealing my retirement savings for immediate luxury consumption. He'd taken the financial wisdom I'd shared over decades of trying to teach him responsibility and weaponized it against me. "Show me the business opportunities, David." I kept my voice level and professional, the same tone I'd used during audit interviews when clients were obviously lying. "Provide documentation of these investments, contracts with legitimate firms, evidence that my money went anywhere except into your personal lifestyle expenses." The silence stretched between us, while David searched for an explanation that didn't exist. Jessica filled the void with increasing desperation, her voice rising as she realized that casual deflection wouldn't resolve this confrontation. "Harold, you're being completely unreasonable. David is your son. Family members support each other through difficult periods. That's what parents do. They invest in their children's future success, even when it requires short-term sacrifices." Support through difficult periods? The phrase would have been laughable if it weren't so insulting. I've supported David for 38 years, Jessica, paid for his education, helped with every financial crisis, provided assistance during every period of unemployment. This isn't support. This is theft with a family relationship used as cover. David began pacing across their expensive hardwood floors, his agitation growing as he realized that his usual combination of charm and manipulation wasn't working. Dad, you have to understand that business development requires upfront investment. The car payments, the housing costs, the professional wardrobe, they're all necessary for maintaining the kind of image that attracts serious investors. Image that attracts investors. I watched my son justify stealing from his elderly father as a business necessity, and something cold settled in my chest. David, you're not attracting investors. You're not developing any business. You're living beyond your means using money stolen from people who trusted you, including your own father. Jessica moved to stand beside David, her arms sliding around his waist in a gesture designed to present a united front against my accusations. Harold, I think you need to consider something important here. David and I have a certain lifestyle to maintain. We have social obligations, professional requirements, appearances that matter in our community. You're living quite simply in that little duplex. You don't need much money at your age. The casual dismissal of my financial security, combined with the implied suggestion that my remaining years were worthless compared to their social status, hit me with stunning force. This woman had just suggested that my retirement savings were better spent on her lifestyle than on my security because I was old and therefore expendable. David's face showed shock at his wife's bluntness, but he didn't contradict me, didn't defend me, didn't express any shame about the sentiment she'd voiced so clearly. Instead, he nodded slightly, as if Jessica had articulated something he'd been thinking but hadn't quite dared to say himself. "You're right, Jessica." My voice came out calm, almost pleasant, though something fundamental had shifted inside me during her revelation. I probably don't need much money at my age. And you're absolutely right that David has appearances to maintain. David straightened, taking confidence from what he interpreted as capitulation. Dad, I'm glad you're finally seeing this from our perspective. The investment will pay off eventually, and everyone will benefit from the patient approach you've always advocated. I folded the bank documents carefully and returned them to their folder. When I looked up, both of them were watching me with the wariness of people who suddenly realized they might have pushed too far, but weren't quite sure why the atmosphere had changed so dramatically.
You know what, David? You're absolutely right about patient approaches and long-term strategies. I've always believed that careful planning and systematic execution produce the best results. I think it's time I applied those principles to our current situation. The drive home took longer than usual because I stopped at 3 different locations, each visit methodical and purposeful. First, the Boise Police Department, where I filed a formal complaint about financial fraud and elder abuse. Second, the Idaho Attorney General's office, where consumer protection specialists dealt regularly with investment scams targeting elderly victims. Finally, Dorothy Chen's house next door, where I needed to have a very important conversation about the deposit I'd noticed in David's bank records. By the time I reached my duplex, the sun was setting behind the mountains that ringed the Boise Valley, painting the sky in shades that reminded me of the beautiful simplicity I'd chosen over the artificial luxury that had destroyed my son's integrity. I had work to do, phone calls to make, evidence to organize. David thought he'd won when I appeared to accept Jessica's explanation about lifestyle maintenance and social obligations. He had no idea that while they were celebrating their successful manipulation, I'd been making mental notes about everything I'd observed. The rental property that exceeded any legitimate income, the luxury vehicles with payments that required my stolen money, the furnishings and lifestyle that could only be sustained through continued fraud. Most importantly, I'd been thinking like the certified public accountant I'd been for 35 years, someone who understood exactly how financial crimes were investigated, prosecuted, and punished. The phone calls I needed to make would wait until tomorrow morning. Tonight, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, methodically documenting every detail of David's fraud, every victim I could identify, every piece of evidence that would be necessary to ensure appropriate consequences. The systematic approach that had served me throughout my professional career would now serve justice, and my son was about to discover that stealing from a retired accountant was a considerably more dangerous mistake than he'd imagined. Thursday morning brought clarity along with my first cup of coffee. The yellow legal pad from the previous evening now contained 3 pages of methodically organized information: names, dates, transaction amounts, and most importantly, patterns that revealed the scope of David's criminal enterprise. What had begun as personal betrayal was revealing itself as systematic fraud targeting multiple elderly victims throughout our community. Dorothy Chen answered her door with the cautious friendliness of someone who'd lived through enough to be wary of unexpected visits. She'd been my neighbor for 8 years, ever since her husband passed away, and left her managing finances she'd never handled alone. Her modest house mirrored my own duplex in its careful maintenance and practical furnishings, the home of someone living carefully on fixed income. "Harold, what a pleasant surprise. Come in, please." Her voice carried warmth, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she noticed the folder I carried. Her living room was tidy and comfortable, filled with photographs of grandchildren she saw too rarely and mementos from the life she'd built with her late husband. "Dorothy, I need to ask you about something important, and I apologize for the personal nature of the question. Have you had any financial dealings with my son David recently?" I watched her face carefully, looking for the recognition that would confirm what David's bank records had already revealed. The change in her expression was immediate and telling. Relief mixed with embarrassment as she realized someone else knew about her situation. "Oh, Harold, I've been so worried about that. David approached me about 6 weeks ago with what seemed like a wonderful opportunity to help both our families."
She invited me to sit at her kitchen table, where she produced her own folder of documents, carefully organized with the attention to detail that elderly people often applied to important financial matters. David had told her that I was facing serious medical expenses, but was too proud to ask for help directly. He'd proposed that she invest in a short-term loan program that would provide me with necessary funds while guaranteeing her a 20% return within 90 days. "Harold, I gave him $15,000. Her voice cracked slightly with the vulnerability of someone admitting to what she now suspected was a terrible mistake. "It represented most of my emergency fund, but David made it sound so safe, so beneficial for everyone involved. He said you were too embarrassed about your health problems to ask family for help directly." The cruelty of David's manipulation was breathtaking. He'd weaponized Dorothy's genuine concern for my well-being, transforming her neighborly compassion into a tool for extracting her carefully guarded savings. The fake medical emergency was particularly vicious because it played on the fears every elderly person carried about healthcare costs and the financial devastation of serious illness. "Dorothy, there are no medical expenses. I'm in perfect health, and David never mentioned any loan program to me." I showed her the bank records that documented where her $15,000 had actually gone. Luxury purchases, restaurant bills, car payments for vehicles that provided no benefit to anyone except David and Jessica. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the evidence, and I watched her face cycle through the same emotions I'd experienced: confusion, recognition, and finally burning anger at the complete violation of trust. "That money was supposed to be for your medical care. He showed me documentation about treatment costs, specialist fees, even travel expenses for medical appointments in Seattle." The documentation would have been professionally prepared, just like the investment materials David had used to defraud me. My son had learned to construct convincing lies, complete with official-looking paperwork and carefully rehearsed explanations designed to overcome the natural skepticism of people who'd lived long enough to recognize most scams. We spent an hour comparing David's techniques, the emotional manipulation tactics he'd used to overcome our resistance, the false urgency he'd created to prevent us from seeking independent verification. Dorothy provided 3 additional names of elderly community members who'd been approached with similar stories, each targeted with variations designed to exploit their specific vulnerabilities and relationships. Frank Williams lived in a senior community near Boise State University, a tidy apartment complex designed for people who'd downsized from family homes but wanted to maintain independence. Frank had been my colleague during the final 5 years of my accounting career,
someone whose professional judgment I'd always respected. His involvement in David's scheme added an additional layer of personal betrayal. Harold, I wondered when someone would start asking questions about this situation. Frank invited me into his apartment with the resigned air of someone who'd been expecting bad news. David's story had been different for him, tailored to exploit Frank's knowledge of business and investment principles rather than relying purely on emotional manipulation. Your son presented himself as someone who'd identified an arbitrage opportunity in municipal bond markets, Frank explained, showing me documents that demonstrated considerably more financial sophistication than David actually possessed. He needed bridge financing to take advantage of timing differences between bond issuances and settlements. The technical language was impressive, but the underlying structure was identical to every other scam David had perpetrated. Frank had invested $22,000, money he'd saved for potential long-term care expenses that might become necessary as he aged.
David had promised 30% returns within 4 months, guaranteed by what appeared to be legitimate municipal securities. The documents looked authentic, complete with official seals and regulatory language that would convince someone without specialized knowledge of securities fraud. The pattern was becoming clear. David had systematically identified elderly people in his father's social circle, researched their backgrounds and financial situations, then constructed individually tailored lies designed to extract their savings. Each victim received a different story, but the core elements remained consistent: false urgency, guaranteed returns, and exploitation of trust relationships within the community. Maria Santos presented the most heartbreaking case of all. Her husband had served 2 tours in Vietnam with my brother, creating a bond that extended to their families decades after military service ended. Maria lived alone now in a small house near the Veterans Administration Medical Center, surviving on her late husband's disability benefits and Social Security payments that totaled less than $1,800 per month. David had approached Maria with a story about helping veteran families purchase homes through a special lending program. He'd shown her photographs of grateful military families, testimonials from previous participants, and documentation that appeared to come from legitimate veteran service organizations. She'd contributed $12,000, representing nearly 2 years of careful savings, because she wanted to honor her husband's memory by helping other military families. The exploitation was particularly vicious because David had researched Maria's background thoroughly enough to know exactly which emotional triggers would override her natural caution about financial commitments. He'd used her grief, her respect for military service, and her desire to create meaning from her husband's sacrifice as tools for extracting money that would be spent on luxury restaurants and designer clothing. By late afternoon, I'd visited 7 elderly victims and documented fraud totaling over $130,000. Each conversation revealed new layers of David's systematic approach: the careful targeting of isolated seniors, the individualized deception strategies, the professional quality documentation designed to overcome skepticism, and the exploitation of existing relationships to establish credibility. The drive to downtown Boise took me past the luxury apartment complex where David and Jessica had been living, the expensive cars still parked in their assigned spaces, purchased with money stolen from people who struggled to afford basic necessities. The contrast was obscene: elderly people rationing medications and avoiding restaurant meals, while my son and his wife enjoyed amenities that would have been luxurious for people with legitimate high incomes. The Idaho Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division occupied several floors of a modern office building near the state capitol, staffed by attorneys and investigators who specialized in financial crimes targeting vulnerable populations. The receptionist directed me to Sandra Walsh, a prosecutor who'd spent 15 years handling elder abuse cases and financial fraud investigations. Sandra reviewed my documentation with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every variation of investment fraud and family exploitation. Mr. Mitchell, in 20 years of prosecution work, I've rarely encountered a case with this level of systematic documentation from victims. Your accounting background shows in every detail of this evidence compilation. The criminal charges would be straightforward: multiple counts of fraud, elder abuse, identity theft if we could prove David had used false credentials to enhance his credibility, and potentially racketeering charges if the pattern of systematic criminal activity met federal guidelines. More importantly, the civil recovery possibilities were extensive because David had been careless about concealing assets purchased with stolen money. Asset forfeiture procedures would allow us to seize the luxury vehicles, expensive furnishings, and other property David had purchased with fraud proceeds. The rental house Woodies could be voided if we could demonstrate it was being paid for with criminal proceeds. Even the designer clothing and jewelry could be recovered and sold to compensate victims. Sandra explained the coordination possibilities that would transform individual fraud cases into a major prosecution with regional implications. Similar patterns had been reported in surrounding counties, suggesting that David's criminal activities extended beyond Boise into a multi-jurisdictional enterprise that would attract federal attention and resources. The timeline would move quickly once formal charges were filed. David's accounts would be frozen immediately to prevent him from spending additional stolen money or transferring assets beyond recovery. The luxury lifestyle that had seemed so secure would collapse within days as legal machinery prevented further access to the funds that had sustained it. Walking back to my car in the late afternoon sunlight, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering David's betrayal: genuine satisfaction in the systematic application of professional expertise to achieve justice. David had used his knowledge of my work to enhance his fraud techniques, but he'd forgotten that accounting principles also applied to forensic investigation and evidence compilation. The phone calls I needed to make that evening would set everything in motion. By tomorrow morning, David would discover that stealing from a retired accountant who understood exactly how financial crimes were prosecuted was considerably more dangerous than he'd calculated. The patient, methodical approach I'd always advocated was about to deliver consequences that would reshape his understanding of family loyalty, professional ethics, and personal responsibility. Friday morning at 8 o'clock sharp, I positioned myself across the street from David and Jessica's rental house with a thermos of coffee and my digital camera. The surveillance felt strange after decades of sitting behind a desk reviewing financial documents, but the investigative principles remained identical: careful observation, systematic documentation, and patient collection of evidence that would support legal action. Jessica emerged at 9:15. Dressed in expensive workout attire that probably cost more than most people spent on clothing in 6 months. She drove the BMW toward downtown Boise, and I followed at a careful distance, maintaining the professional detachment I'd learned during audit investigations where personal feelings could compromise objective analysis. Traffic was light enough to track her movements without being obvious, and her destination revealed exactly what I'd expected to find. The shopping district near 8th Street attracted people with serious money to spend, and Jessica moved through it with the confidence of someone accustomed to luxury purchases. First stop was a jewelry store where she examined pieces that glittered under professional lighting, each item representing more than most elderly people had available for monthly expenses. The sales associate clearly knew her well, bringing out special collections and treating her with the deference reserved for regular customers with substantial credit limits. Through my camera's zoom lens, I documented her selection of earrings priced at $3,400, nearly twice Dorothy Chen's monthly Social Security income, spent casually on accessories that would be worn a few times before being forgotten. The transaction was completed with credit cards that were being paid for with money stolen from people who counted every dollar and made careful decisions about necessities like prescription medications and heating bills. Her next destination provided even more damaging evidence: the Mercedes dealership on Fairview Avenue, where Jessica spent 40 minutes examining luxury vehicles in the price range that would require financing beyond any legitimate income David might claim. The salesman walked her through features and options with obvious enthusiasm,
discussing lease terms and monthly payments that can only be sustained through continued fraud against elderly victims. What made the surveillance particularly valuable was Jessica's phone conversations, conducted loudly enough to be overheard when she stepped outside the dealership for privacy. The name Ryan appeared repeatedly, along with discussions about vacation plans, expensive dinners, and gift purchases that had nothing to do with any relationship with David. The pattern was clear. Jessica was using money stolen from my retirement savings and 7 other elderly victims to fund a relationship with someone who wasn't her husband. The restaurant meeting at noon confirmed everything the morning surveillance had suggested. Ryan Torres waited at a corner table in one of Boise's most expensive establishments, a man in his 30s with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested he'd grown accustomed to being financially supported by others. When Jessica arrived, their greeting was intimate and possessive, nothing like the casual friendship she would later claim if confronted with the evidence. I positioned myself at the bar with a clear view of their table, close enough to observe their interaction while remaining inconspicuous among other lunch customers. The gift presentation was theatrical and revealing. Jessica made a show of the expensive watch she'd purchased that morning, fastening it around Ryan's wrist while he admired the craftsmanship and weight of something that represented 2 months of Frank Williams' fixed income. Their conversation, overheard in fragments when the restaurant noise level dropped, revealed the scope of Jessica's deception and the calculated nature of her exploitation of David's criminal activities. She spoke about her husband with contempt, describing him as weak and easily manipulated, someone whose desperation for her approval made him willing to steal from his own father and elderly neighbors. Ryan responded with amusement rather than concern, clearly comfortable with benefiting from criminal proceeds as long as he maintained plausible deniability about their source. The most damaging revelation came when Jessica explicitly discussed the timeline for extracting additional funds from elderly victims before legal consequences became inevitable. She understood that David's fraud could only continue for a limited period, but she seemed confident that they could gather enough money to establish a comfortable lifestyle with Ryan once David faced prosecution and imprisonment for his crimes. The afternoon surveillance took me to locations that documented the full scope of money being spent with criminal proceeds. A spa where Jessica received treatments costing more than Maria Santos spent on groceries in 2 months. A boutique where she purchased designer handbags that represented George Patterson's entire disability compensation for 3 months. An art gallery where she examined paintings priced higher than most people's annual income, discussing payment plans with sales staff who treated her like a serious collector. Each stop provided additional photographic evidence of money being transformed from elderly people's security into luxury items that served no purpose except displaying wealth to impress people like Ryan Torres. The contrast was morally obscene. People who'd worked their entire lives and saved carefully for retirement, watching their security disappear into purchases that would be discarded when newer luxury items caught Jessica's attention. The return to their rental house at 4:30 brought David into the surveillance picture for the first time all day. His BMW pulled into the driveway just minutes after Jessica arrived, suggesting coordination that had become routine. Through telephoto observation, I watched their interaction in the driveway, noting the casual way they discussed their separate activities without any appearance of the guilt or concern that should accompany systematic theft from vulnerable elderly people.
What struck me most forcefully was the complete absence of any productive activity. David hadn't spent the day pursuing legitimate business opportunities, meeting with potential clients, or engaging in any work that might generate the income necessary to support their lifestyle. Instead, he'd spent stolen money on recreational activities while Jessica used additional stolen funds to maintain her relationship with another man. Neither of them seemed to consider the elderly victims whose security they'd destroyed or the inevitable legal consequences of their systematic criminal behavior. The evening brought a phone call that provided the final piece of evidence needed to demonstrate the full scope of David's fraud network. Sandra Walsh from the Attorney General's office had received cooperation from law enforcement agencies in surrounding counties, revealing that David's activities extended far beyond Boise into a regional pattern of elder abuse that had attracted federal attention.
Harold, we've identified at least 15 additional victims across 3 counties, Sandra explained, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd assembled an overwhelming case. Your son and daughter-in-law have been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise targeting elderly people throughout southwestern Idaho. The total fraud amount exceeds $400,000. The federal charges would include wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse across state lines if we could demonstrate that any victims live near the Oregon or Nevada borders. More importantly, the federal conviction guidelines for systematic elder abuse included mandatory restitution, asset forfeiture, and prison sentences that would make David's comfortable lifestyle a distant memory for several years. Sandra had coordinated with local law enforcement to execute search warrants and asset seizure orders simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions, preventing David and Jessica from transferring property or liquidating assets before they could be recovered for victim compensation. The timeline would move rapidly once the operation began, typically within 72 hours of initial contact with suspects. The surveillance photographs I'd collected would be crucial for demonstrating that David and Jessica were actively spending criminal proceeds on luxury items while knowing that their victims were facing financial hardship as a direct result of the fraud. The evidence of Jessica's extramarital relationship would support charges of conspiracy and demonstrate that the criminal activity was planned and systematic rather than the result of temporary financial desperation. Saturday morning brought news that the legal machinery had begun moving with the precision I'd expected from professional law enforcement. David's accounts had been frozen overnight, preventing access to funds that might otherwise be transferred or spent before recovery. Jessica's credit cards had been suspended, and liens had been placed on both luxury vehicles to prevent them from being sold or hidden. The phone call I'd been expecting came at 10:30. David's voice tight with panic and confusion as he realized that his comfortable lifestyle had disappeared overnight without warning or explanation. "Dad, something terrible has happened. All our accounts are frozen and the police want to question us about financial irregularities. I think there's been some kind of mistake with the banking system." "There's no mistake, David. The legal system is responding appropriately to systematic elder abuse and financial fraud. You'll have opportunities to explain your activities to prosecutors and federal investigators who specialize in exactly these types of crimes." The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes before David realized that his father wasn't going to provide assistance or emotional support for dealing with the consequences of criminal behavior. The systematic approach I'd always advocated was delivering results that would reshape his understanding of personal responsibility and professional accountability. Jessica called an hour later, her voice cracking with desperation as she began to understand that the lifestyle she'd built on other people's suffering was collapsing with mathematical precision. "Harold, please, you have to help us understand what's happening. This is destroying everything we've worked for, everything we've built together." "You built nothing, Jessica. You stole from elderly people and spent their money on luxury items while they worried about affording basic necessities. The destruction you're experiencing is simply the natural consequence of systematic criminal behavior, delivered through proper legal channels with appropriate professional oversight." Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, I walked up the steps of the Ada County Courthouse wearing my best suit and carrying the briefcase that had accompanied me through 35 years of professional accounting and 3 weeks of the most important investigation of my life. Sandra Walsh waited beside the entrance, her confidence reflecting the strength of a case built on systematic evidence collection and meticulous documentation. The courtroom gallery held faces I'd come to know well over the past weeks. Dorothy Chen sat in the front row, her quiet dignity representing every elderly person who'd been targeted because criminals assumed they were too vulnerable to fight back effectively. Frank Williams had driven in from his senior community, bringing with him the professional expertise that had helped validate our evidence compilation. Maria Santos clutched a photograph of her late husband, a reminder that David's crimes had violated not just financial trust, but the sacred memory of military service. David sat at the defendant's table beside his court-appointed attorney, the expensive clothing replaced by a simple gray suit that reflected his new financial reality. The confident posture I'd observed during his luxury lifestyle had been replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone facing consequences that couldn't be avoided through charm or manipulation. Jessica was notably absent, having fled to Oregon when asset seizure made her comfortable lifestyle impossible to maintain. Judge Richardson entered with the gravity appropriate for a federal elder abuse case that had drawn attention throughout the Pacific Northwest. The evidence Sandra Walsh had compiled filled 3 boxes, representing the most comprehensive fraud prosecution the district had seen in recent years. The systematic nature of David's crimes, the sophisticated targeting of vulnerable victims, and the complete absence of any legitimate business purpose had created a textbook example of organized criminal activity. "Mr. David Mitchell," the judge addressed my son directly, "you stand accused of 15 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of elder abuse, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, and systematic exploitation of vulnerable adults across multiple jurisdictions. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor." David's voice carried none of the confidence I'd heard when he was explaining his fictional investment opportunities. 3 weeks of frozen assets and federal investigation had taught him what 40 years of parenting had failed to accomplish: that actions have consequences that cannot be avoided through clever explanations or emotional manipulation. Sandra Walsh stood to present the prosecution's sentencing recommendation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years seeking justice for victims exactly like those David had targeted. "Your Honor, the defendant's crimes represent a calculated exploitation of elderly community members who trusted him because of family and social connections. The total fraud amount exceeds $450,000, affecting 18 victims across 3 counties. The victim impact statements filled nearly an hour, each elderly person describing not just the financial damage, but the emotional devastation of having their trust betrayed by someone they'd considered family." Dorothy Chen's voice trembled as she explained how David's theft had forced her to consider selling her home and moving to assisted living she couldn't afford.
Frank Williams described the humiliation of realizing that his professional expertise had been manipulated by someone he trusted because of our collegial relationship. Maria Santos provided the most powerful testimony, explaining how David had used her husband's military service and her grief over his death as tools for extracting money she'd saved by choosing between medications and proper nutrition. Her quiet dignity transformed the courtroom into a memorial for every elderly person who'd been targeted because criminals assumed their vulnerability meant they wouldn't fight back effectively. Judge Richardson reviewed the evidence methodically, examining bank records, surveillance photographs, and documentation that demonstrated the sophisticated planning behind David's systematic criminal enterprise. The federal sentencing guidelines for elder abuse included mandatory minimums that reflected society's determination to protect vulnerable populations from exactly the kind of exploitation David had practiced. "Mr. Mitchell, this court sentences you to 4 years federal imprisonment, followed by 3 years supervised probation with mandatory restitution of all stolen funds, plus interest and penalties." The judge's voice carried institutional authority that made clear this wasn't negotiable or subject to appeal based on family relationships or personal circumstances. The asset forfeiture order included everything David and Jessica had purchased with criminal proceeds: the BMW and Mercedes vehicles, the expensive furnishings from their rental house, jewelry, artwork, and luxury items that would be liquidated to provide victim compensation. The proceeds would be distributed proportionally among the 18 victims, ensuring that every elderly person who'd been defrauded would receive complete restitution. Outside the courthouse, local media gathered to cover a story that had become a regional example of successful elder abuse prosecution. I spoke briefly to reporters, choosing words that reflected the satisfaction of seeing systematic criminal behavior meet equally systematic legal consequences. Justice has been served through proper channels by professionals who understand that financial crimes against elderly people deserve the most serious prosecution possible. The victims gathered afterward for a brief celebration that felt more like a memorial service for their lost innocence about family loyalty and community trust. Dorothy Chen thanked me repeatedly for organizing the coalition that had made prosecution possible, but I knew the real credit belonged to a legal system that worked when citizens used it professionally and systematically. The drive home took me past the luxury apartment complex where David and Jessica had lived their temporary lifestyle funded by other people's suffering. The building looked exactly the same, but their unit was empty now, cleaned out by asset recovery specialists who'd cataloged every item purchased with stolen money. The BMW and Mercedes were gone, replaced by nothing except the accountability that should have guided their choices from the beginning. That evening brought correspondence from elderly people in neighboring states who'd heard about our case and wanted advice about organizing their own fraud prosecutions. The systematic approach we developed was replicable, providing a methodology that could be applied wherever criminals targeted vulnerable populations with sophisticated financial schemes. Sandra Walsh called with final details about asset liquidation and victim compensation schedules. The efficiency of the legal process had impressed federal prosecutors who specialized in elder abuse cases, creating precedent that would benefit future victims who found themselves in similar circumstances. Professional methodology had triumphed over emotional manipulation, proving that careful planning and systematic execution could deliver justice even in cases involving family betrayal.
My small duplex felt exactly the same as it had before David's crimes shattered my faith in family loyalty. But something fundamental had changed in my understanding of personal agency and professional responsibility. The vulnerable elderly man who'd been targeted for systematic exploitation had transformed into someone who could organize community resistance and achieve institutional justice through proper legal channels. The phone rang one final time. Dorothy Chen, with news that her restitution check had arrived, allowing her to remain in her home and maintain the independence that David's theft had threatened to destroy. Frank Williams had received full compensation plus penalties, restoring his confidence in the community connections that had made his retirement meaningful. Maria Santos could afford her medications again while honoring her husband's memory through the justice that had vindicated his sacrifice. Trust, once broken through deliberate criminal behavior, could never be fully repaired, but justice pursued through systematic professional methods had delivered consequences that validated every principle I'd learned during 35 years of accounting work. The system had functioned exactly as designed when used by people who understood that documentation, patience, and methodical execution could defeat even the most sophisticated criminal manipulation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.